Yeah, I should re-emphasize presentations, not papers. I am not an academic, nor will I pretend to be. You'll probably realize it very, very quickly as I start speaking. So thank you again for McGill for having us here today. I'll tell you a little bit more. My talk is a little bit more anecdotal based on my experience as somebody who's been working in the cannabis industry in the US for several years now. And my entry into the cannabis industry actually started in the simplest of forms. It started with a text message from my mother to my younger sister and me, and this was in late 2013. And the text said, "Do you know where to get marijuana?" Now, let me set the stage a little bit. My mother and both my parents, for that matter, are Pakistani. They are devout Muslims. And while my sisters and I were growing up, pretty much thought that only bad things happen after dark. So when I get a text message like this from my mother, I'm very confused. And my sister immediately called me, and she was like, "Do you think this is a test?" And I was like, "Well, I'm old enough now that I feel like she can't be testing us at this point, but maybe." And we were also raised in a very small town in Ohio that's considered the Rust Belt of America, so use your imagination for what that means. And my sister and I knew exactly where to get cannabis, but we didn't necessarily want to tell our mother that we knew where to get cannabis. Now, the reason that she was asking if we knew where to get cannabis is a more relevant part of the story, and perhaps what some people here today might identify with. My grandfather, my mother's father, was suffering from stage 4 lung cancer. And after his first round of chemo, my mom, who was his primary caretaker, realized that there had to be something else that she could do to keep him comfortable in his final months. So like many people who start looking at cannabis, particularly around chemo, she came across cannabis. Now, even though my sister and I knew exactly where to get cannabis and probably could have had it delivered to my parents' doorstep, which I can only imagine how that would have gone over, all we knew how to get was flour, which was not something I was going to give someone who had lung cancer. But even beyond that, I wouldn't trust the product for someone who had a compromised immune system. So after going into my own kind of Googling spiral, it struck me that it was pretty crazy that there were people who were suffering from cancer and other illnesses, really, and there was anecdotal evidence that cannabis could help them. Maybe not cure it, but at least keep them comfortable later stages of the disease. And it kind of shocked me that there was no way to safely access something like that, and something that was considered a natural product. So not long after my days of Googling cannabis, I landed myself a job post-MBA at one of the earliest investment firms, cannabis investment firms called Privateer Holdings. So even though the industry is now overwhelmingly white rich men with MBAs, I feel like as a brown, not rich woman with an MBA, I have to say don't hate the MBAs. We're not all bad, although I can kind of understand why there's a little bit of a reputation there. So while at Privateer, I also built one of the earliest recreational brands in the US, Marley Natural, which I'll discuss more in a bit, and later became a venture capital investor and consultant for a variety of startups in cannabis, both in the US and Canada. And they range from anything from cultivation to media to brands. One of the most fascinating and perhaps ridiculous things that I learned since starting in the industry is that the reason that cannabis was actually made illegal in the US pretty much had nothing to do with health and science and everything to do with economics and racism. There's obviously a lengthier history that I could go through, and we've touched on a little of that both between yesterday and today, so I won't go into it. But I wanted to point out that cannabis obviously used to be a big part of American medicine and agriculture, but somehow it managed to become a Schedule I narcotic under the Controlled Substances Act. And just for a refresher, for those who don't know, Schedule I means that it's listed as a product that has the highest abuse potential and no accepted medical use, according to the US federal government. Now, in contrast, cocaine and meth are Schedule II drugs, so they're considered dangerous, but not as dangerous in cannabis. Xanax and Valium are Schedule IV, meaning they're drugs with a low potential for abuse and a low risk of dependence. Yeah, glad you had that response. So we have this federally legal product that was becoming legal on a state level in the US and creating new micro markets and economic opportunities. And in 2014, on my first day on the job in cannabis, I was tasked with creating and shepherding the launch of one of the first national recreational brands in the US, Marley Natural, which was a partnership with Bob Marley's family. Now, I love Bob Marley, but to be honest, I struggled with the idea initially of creating the brand. It felt like all the things that I had absolutely not signed up for when I joined the industry. Creating a product for recreational use versus medical, working on a celebrity brand, which also kind of felt like a stereotype, appropriating an image and a culture that was targeted at one audience for sales, but profited by another that really looked nothing like the brand. I went home that day and I felt like maybe I'd made a mistake by taking this job and joining this industry. But I also was kind of terrified because I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never built a brand before. I'd never built a startup before. And this was a new industry that had no precedent for it. I'd love to say that they picked me because they thought that I was so smart and I was the person who was going to figure it out. But that's absolutely not the case. It really just because I was the only one there who had the time to do it. So initially, after this kind of initial freak-out period, I realized that we had a pretty unique opportunity to build something that hadn't been done in the industry before. And hopefully we could do some good while at it and encourage other groups to do the same. We wanted to make something new and innovative that appealed to a wide audience, but we also didn't want to make it too amazing because we were worried about appealing to kids. Now, I don't have children, but I have nieces who think I'm the coolest. And they worry, and I worry about them, right? Like, what if you put a product in front of them that looks really cool, and then what does that imply about what we're saying about cannabis and, a lot of other products? And at this time, there were no rules around it. So because we didn't have clear rules, we decided that we would adopt rules that applied to alcohol, tobacco, and pharma because we had nothing else to operate on. And I don't necessarily like drawing the comparisons directly between those industries because I do think that there are differences, but there is some logic in how they operate, how cannabis will operate, and I think even more so what we've learned from other industries about what we shouldn't do in cannabis. So Marley Natural was an interesting experiment with branded product, which hadn't been done in the US before, and once an industry that few wanted to touch for fear of legal repercussions or reputational risks, the industry has been flooded with new business ideas and wealthy investors. And if you think about it, cannabis is really this confluence of so many different social forces. And I think it's one of the things that really has intrigued me the whole time that I've been in it. There's obviously this huge element of history, public health, medical research, and then economic opportunity and innovation. The list really goes on, and we could probably talk about it for days if you let me. The onslaught of a lot of these new businesses and a lot of the new ideas, required a lot of different businesses. So, of course, cultivation is a really big part of cannabis, but businesses that aid those cultivations, infused product makers, and dispensaries which are referred to as ancillary businesses, they're actually just as important and represent the largest sector of the US cannabis industry that's growing right now. So ancillary businesses can be anything from extraction technology to industry consulting with literally everything in between. And they're all businesses that never actually touch cannabis. So the need for these businesses has actually snowballed the most in the last couple of years because cannabis needs the same ecosystem of products and services that any other industry needs. But because of the constraints of federal policy in the US, mainstream businesses that do the same thing in a different industry won't touch cannabis. So companies have been developed specifically for cannabis. Now, what does that mean? So they're obviously their brands, their distributors, their testing labs, their tech platforms, their security, insurance, payroll, packaging, media, and even new forms of consumption methods. So there used to be just flower, which I think is pretty prominent everywhere, but we're starting to see a decrease in smoking, and now everyone's vaping or eating or drinking or applying ointments or taking a tincture. There are products and brands specifically that are for athletes, that are for soccer moms, that are for aging communities. There are even products that are specifically for your libido or creativity. And there are products for pets. Now, and these are just cannabis products. There are also hemp and CBD only products, and most of those didn't really exist a few years ago. And once thought to be just medical or recreational, cannabis is also part of this booming wellness industry in the US. So adults of all ages we're seeing are experiencing what they deem to be the benefits of cannabis and hemp and CBD, and those numbers continue to grow. A lot of adults are turning to cannabis as what they believe is a cleaner and healthier substitute to smoking or drinking. Consumers are also trying CBD products as a natural, non-pharmaceutical form of relief, and as a result, we're starting to see the rising number of groups across legal age groups. We're starting to see that number go up quite a bit. And as we look at demographics, we see that women have always enjoyed cannabis, but the vast majority of cannabis buyers have traditionally been men. So improved access and safety has combined with an expanding menu of these products and brands has really enabled women to start accessing the market more. So one thing that I'll kind of contradict to a point that was made earlier on, that there is no legal delivery within any jurisdiction. There actually is. In California, there's a company called Ease, which is a San Francisco-based tech company that provides delivery service between dispensaries and consumers. And I've experienced Ease, and I also have a lot of friends who live in the area, and I've had friends who will text me and tell me that they got a delivery between ordering and getting the product, it was 8 minutes. And that's pretty average. 8 to 10 minutes is the average that they run. And it's fairly prominent in San Francisco, the Bay Area, and other parts of California. And California itself is its own country, so you can only imagine how many people are utilizing Ease there. Because Ease is utilized so much in California, there's actually quite a bit of data now that we have from the service. And Ease said that the number of women using Ease alone went up 32% between 2016 and 2017. The company also reports that the modern marijuana consumer spends more on cannabis per year than average Americans spend on personal care, alcohol, and tobacco combined. According to that same study, 13% of women in California who were cannabis consumers who were surveyed, they stopped drinking entirely, replacing alcohol with cannabis. So the total percentage of orders from baby boomers also increased 19% year over year. And the largest growth among any generation, which actually was the largest growth among any generation on Ease's platform. That's followed closely by Gen X, who increased 13%. So this trend suggests that a significant part of the industry's growth is due to people looking more for wellness than therapeutic, at least according to Ease. Ease also reported that in California in 2016, its customers placed an order every 30 seconds. So in 2017, that number increased 200%, resulting in an order every 10 seconds. So in the time that it's taking me to read this sentence, 2 people on the other side of the US have already ordered cannabis, and it's 8:30 in the morning. So one thing that often strikes me while working in the cannabis industry is how it's also become the fastest growing segment when it comes from a jobs perspective. In the US, the number of cannabis industry postings reportedly increased almost 700% year over year and 79% quarter over quarter in Q4 2017. So what does that mean for all those people who became felons due to cannabis prohibition? So we're obviously in a very high growth period in the cannabis industry, but it's also kind of dangerous because we run the risk of leaving behind the many minorities who paid the price in the past for being affiliated with this industry. Now, a few speakers yesterday discussed this topic in depth, so I won't go into it too much, but I think it's worth repeating because it's so important that cannabis, sometimes more than anything, is about social justice. Each shiny new dispensary that looks like an Apple store or luxury cannabis brand helps us forget the plant's highly racialized history in Canada and in the US, all while not doing too much about it to right the wrongs of these marginalized communities, especially in the private sector. And don't get me wrong, I love shiny. I mean, I firmly believe that each innovation and enhancement in normalizing the plant further enhances the vision and goals of the cannabis community, but we want cannabis to be distributed in a socially responsible, community-oriented, and professional way. I think someone like Cory Booker, who's a Democratic senator from New Jersey, said it best, that the so-called war on drugs hasn't been a war on drugs, but a war on people. From a policy perspective, we need to put measures in place that right the wrongs of past missteps and allow for records to be expunged in a way that's attainable for the populations that are affected. We should also be using some of the tax proceeds to invest in those communities, and I won't get into tax because that is not my area. And things like job training or access to starting businesses. In America, we've actually made it fairly difficult to enter the cannabis industry unless you're coming from a place of privilege, which is often associated with race or socioeconomic status. Opportunity breeds achievement, and historical inequities aren't going to go away on their own, so it's kind of on us, particularly in the private sector, to start making those advancements. It's, of course, incumbent on people like me and investors and operators who have a stake in the industry to push for inclusion and ensure that we aren't reinforcing prohibited practices from other industries. Now, we know we have to bridge the gap when it comes to hiring practices, funding, resources, et cetera, but sometimes the business decisions are a bit at odds with what we would want the right decision to be. In all honesty, it's something that I often struggle with because feeling empowered to make these very large-scale decisions, they involve so many different groups. It's private sector business, it's federal policy, it's local policy. There are all these different groups involved, but I'm encouraged by being in the industry for the last couple of years that we're starting to see these shifts over time. From a national policy perspective, it's not all bleak in the US. As of last week, and one of the clearest signs yet that federal cannabis politics are changing pretty quickly, one of the most vocal and longtime proponents of the war on drugs in Congress, Chuck Schumer, announced that he's filing legislation to end federal cannabis prohibition. Schumer announced that he plans to introduce a bill to remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act altogether so that states can set their own policies. That news came the same day that Bernie Sanders joined Cory Booker and Kirsten Gillibrand in sponsoring an even more far-reaching marijuana legislation, the Marijuana Justice Act, which would not only exempt cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, but would also withhold funding from states that have racially disparate marijuana enforcement rates. The legislation would also direct federal courts to expunge prior cannabis convictions and would allow people punished under disproportionately enforced cannabis law to file civil lawsuits against those states. Senator Sanders said, "We are spending $80 billion locking people up. Think about what it would mean if we invested that money in our people instead of in our jails." And this isn't just a Democratic issue. A key Trump ally, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, announced that he'll be filing new legislation as well to support the president's pledge of changing federal cannabis laws. Now, this all is very conveniently coinciding with the approach of the 2018 midterm elections, in which all 435 seats in the House of Representatives and 35 in the Senate are up for grabs. But we'll take what we can get. After all, 6 out of 10 Americans do support legalization, and in most places, votes do win elections. So cannabis is a curious product. Got that. Cannabis is a curious product because it has the ability to facilitate the persecution of the unprotected classes and to economically and socially empower those same populations. In my opinion, we can only truly harness its power for good if cannabis legislation in the US and across the world not only ends prohibition, but actively rights our collective wrongs with the war on drugs and releases communities from these laws that were designed to kind of follow them around in perpetuity. It's also very much the responsibility of the private sector to do the same. As the industry further develops, it has the opportunity to become one that creates new norms and promotes progressive social and economic ideals while actively working to, I think, correct the not-so-silent racism that has been exceeded for a very long time. Cannabis is no longer about consumption in a single way for a single reason. It's also about health, it's about safety, it's design, and increasingly about entrepreneurship, and a dozen other things. But I really hope that many of you continue to explore the industry, and I think at a minimum continue to ask questions and encourage others to do the same. Thank you all so much for being here.